First, I created a Zoom clone, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to create a WhatsApp clone, and this is going to be by far the largest React project on my channel. It's going to have a custom client, a custom server, hooks, context, custom components, everything is going to be working together to create this amazing clone. Let's get started now. How would you like to have a free AI-powered code review tool that tells you exactly what's wrong with your code, how to refactor it, and how to write it better? I mean, this sounds amazing, and luckily for you, today's video sponsor, Bold, is going to give you just that. This tool not only gives you your generic linter output, but also takes it a step further and uses their AI to give you powerful insight into how to refactor your code to make it cleaner, what different metrics your code is following or not following, and just general advice on how to write your code in a better way that's going to give you a more maintainable and more bug-free code. If that sounds interesting, make sure you check out the link down in the description to get started on their incredibly generous free tier, and also stick around till the end of this video where I show you how to use Bold on this exact project. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name is Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. So if that sounds interesting, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. Now, before we get jumping into all of the complex code, I first want to just show you exactly what the application does because it's fairly complex. Think about this very similar to WhatsApp. You have your own personal phone number and you're able to message people based on their own phone numbers. So to get started, first you either need to enter in your phone number if you've already accessed the app, or you just create a new ID and it's going to create a new identity for you. Let's just do that for all three of these users. And we're greeted here with our different conversations. Obviously we have none, as well as our contacts, which again, we have none. So let's add a contact. You can see down here, we have the ID of all the users in the bottom corner of the screen. So let's just copy this ID for this left side one here. And we're going to create a new contact on the right side that has that ID. We're going to give it the name here, which is left. And let's just create that. And we're going to do the same thing down here. We're going to copy this contact. And it's just going to be called bottom right. And now what we can do is create a conversation between left and bottom right. Click create. And now you can see we're messaging left and bottom right, and we can just send them a message. Say, hi, this is top right. And all we got to do is come over here and click send. And you can see that this message populated up here, as well as on all the other screens. So it says, hi, this is top right. And you can see that on everybody's different screen, and you can see their name. And since we don't have these contacts added, it just has their ID. So let's add the contact here. We can say new contact, and this is going to be for top right. Click create. Now you can see it says top right here instead, and our conversation says it's between this person and top right. Let's just send a message that says this is left, and we're going to just click send, and you can see that that's now sent to everybody, and you can see that it's populating the name properly. And this is what we're going to create in this video. So now with all that out of the way, let's just close out of all of these different browsers and begin working on the code. And as you can see, I already have a little bit of stuff done. I have an empty folder called server, where we're going to put all of our Node.js server code for managing the communication between our different clients. And then we have a client folder, and all I've done inside this folder is run npx create React app. So I just have a boilerplate React app here. And if we just change our directory into the client, and I just click npm start here, that's actually going to start up our React application so we can actually see this running and see what we have. And as you can see, if I just full screen this, put it off to the side, wait for that to load up, it's going to just be a boilerplate React application. There we go. And for us, we don't really need any of this boilerplate stuff. We can remove a lot of these different files, all these CS and test files. Let's just get rid of all of those. Service worker, we don't need any of that. And then inside of our app, let's just clear out all of these different files we no longer need. Delete everything in here and just say hello world. Make sure that's inside of a string. Whoops. There we go. And then inside of our index, we can get rid of all this service worker stuff down here. And now if we save, we should see the hello world text being popped up over here. And of course, we're getting an error saying logo.svg is not available. So inside of our app, make sure we save this. Now if we refresh, we're getting an error about index.css. Delete that from here. And now finally, there we go. We have our text hello world being printed out to the screen, so we know everything is working. Now there's a ton of different places we could start with this application, from the server to the client, but I think the best place to start is that login page, just so we can get something easy to look at that's going to be really quick to create. So let's in here create a folder called components. We'll just say components. And inside of here, let's just move app.js. And we're also going to create a new file, which we're just going to call login.js. And if we just refresh over here and make sure in our index, we have everything referenced properly. So let's just save that. There we go. Make sure up here we have /components/app since we moved that file. Now everything's working again. Now inside of our login component, we can just type RFC and hit enter. That's going to generate this boilerplate code for us. And if we go into our extensions here, the reason that's working is I have an extension called ES7 React Redux GraphQL React Native Snippets. That gives me those nice snippets. You can download that if you want, or just manually type everything out. Now inside of our app, we're going to be using Bootstrap for all of our styling, because if we did all the styling manually, it would take a long time, a lot longer than this video already is going to be. So we're going to use Bootstrap for simplicity. So let's just come in here, cd into our client, and then we just want to npm I react-bootstrap. And we also want to install just Bootstrap itself because we actually need those CSS files in order to work with Bootstrap. And speaking of those CSS files, we need to put that inside of our app here. And actually, instead of putting this in our app, I'm actually going to put this in our index.js. It just makes a little bit more sense. So we can just say import bootstrap, and we want to go into the dist folder. So we're going to say /dist/css, and we want to get a file called bootstrap.min.css. This is going to be the minified CSS file that gives us everything we need to know about Bootstrap. And if we save, immediately we should see now we have Bootstrap styles being applied as we get that different font and different margins and padding and everything. And that's going to allow us to use all these different Bootstrap components from that Bootstrap library that we installed, that React Bootstrap. So now inside of login here, we can actually start making our login form. So the first thing that I want to do inside this login form here is I just want to import some stuff from Bootstrap. We're going to get the container out of here. We're going to get that from react-bootstrap. And now instead of having this div wrap everything, we're going to have a container. So we can just say container, close that off, get rid of this div down here. And now we have a container that we can put all of our text inside of for this login. Let's just say hello login. Login, there we go. And then in our app, instead of rendering out hello world, let's just come in here and render out login. And we want to make sure that we import that. So we'll say import login from /login. Now we should see that text hello login show up over here as soon as everything compiles. There we go. That's exactly what we wanted. Now the next step is to go into this login and actually do stuff inside of here besides just the text hello login. And for this, we're going to need a form. So I'm just going to import the form component here from React Bootstrap. And now I'm just going to wrap a form inside of our container. So we'll say form, close that off. We're essentially going to need to have a group that tells us to enter our ID. So we can say form.group. This is going to allow us to create a group. And inside of this group, we're going to need a label. So form.label. And this label just says enter your ID. I'll just have it lowercase like that. And then we're also going to need inside of here a control. This is essentially our input. And we tell it that we want to have a type. In our case, a type of text is going to be perfect. So we'll say type text. And then instead of using onChange events and value, I'm just going to use a ref for handling all of the changes. And we're just going to create an ID ref. So up here with React, we're going to import the use ref hook. This, in my opinion, is just going to be easier for this very simple use case. And if you need more information about how refs work, make sure to check out my full tutorial on use ref. I'll link it in the cards and the description. So now we can just say ID ref is equal to use ref. And essentially this ID ref is now going to reference this input control here so we can actually get the value from it when we submit our form. Another thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that I set this to required, and that way we have to enter our input into this ID, otherwise it won't let us actually submit our page and go forward. Now if we save, let's just see what that looks like. You can see we have enter your ID and we have the field to enter it. So everything's looking good so far, but I want to center this in the center of our screen instead of all the way at the top here. So for our container, let's just set a class name here, which is equal to align items center. That's going to center our items vertically. And we're also going to change this to be flexbox. So that way we actually are able to do that. But you'll notice when we save, it doesn't actually change anything about this to be aligned center. So what we need to do instead is set a style here. And this style is just going to be a height of 100 VH. And that's essentially just going to make it stretch all the way across our screen, as you can see here. And now you can see that we have our information centered in our screen vertically, just like this. But the next thing we want to do is make sure we have our input stretch all the way across our screen like it was before. So for our form, we can just really easily set a class name here of W100. That's going to give us 100% width. And as you can see, our form input has now spread out to fill that entire remaining space. Now we have our actual field for entering it. We have our label. The next thing to do is actually set up what's going to happen when we submit our form. And to submit our form, we need to have buttons to do that. So let's come down here and we're just going to create a button. Whoops, button. And this is coming from React Bootstrap, so make sure we import that up here. My VS Code did that automatically for me. And inside of this button, we're just going to have the text, which is going to say login. And I want to make sure that I come in here and I set the type of this button to submit. So this is the actual button that gets clicked to submit our form. Just like that. Now let's just click save. You can see we have our login button right here. Now the next thing I want to do is create another button. This one is not going to have a type at all because it's just going to default to the type of button, but it is going to have a variant, and that variant is going to be secondary. It's going to give it a nice gray color. And for this one, we're just going to say create a new ID. This is what happens if we don't already have an ID that exists. So now let's just save and see how that looks. You can see we have our two buttons. Let's just add a little spacing in there. So let's say class name is MR2. That's going to give us a little margin on the right-hand side of this button. And there we go. That spaces them out exactly like we want. Now, the next thing that we need to work on is what happens when we actually submit our form. We can come in here and say on submit is going to be equal to some function. We're just going to call this handle submit. And let's just create that function up above. If I can spell properly, there we go. Function handle submit, and it's going to take in the event from this. And all we want to do is say e.prevent default. This is essentially going to prevent our page from refreshing, since when you submit a form, it posts to the actual page you're on. We don't want that, so we're going to prevent that behavior. And instead, what we actually want to do is we want to call some function for when we create our ID. And we're going to actually store all of our state for our ID inside this app component because it's going to be shared across our entire application. So we're going to use the use state hook up here, say use state. And again, if you're not familiar with the use state hook, I have an entire video on it. I'll link in the cards in description. And we can just come in here and say const ID and set ID is going to be equal to use state. So now we actually have the state for our ID set up. We can pass our ID. Actually, we don't even need to pass our ID in here, but we do need to pass in our set ID to be set ID. And instead of calling this set ID, I'm just going to call this on ID submit, because this is going to be what happens when we submit our form. So now we have an ability to set our ID whenever we have our on ID submit. So now what I can do inside of our login is take in that on ID submit that we're passing into it. And down here, I can call that and I can pass it the value of our ID ref. So I can see ID ref.current.value. That's going to get the value of this control down here. And it's going to pass it to this on ID submit function. And just to make sure all of this is actually working, up here, we're going to just come in here and also print out our ID. So let's just indent that a little bit, open up a fragment here, and we're just going to say ID. Make sure this is indented, and close off our fragment. Now if we save, we enter in an ID and click login, you'll see our ID is being printed out. So we know that it's actually setting our ID when we click login. If we click login again, you can see it's changing our ID as we want. Now the next thing to focus on is this create a new ID button, because right now it doesn't do anything, but it should create a random ID for us. So inside of here, an easy way to create a random ID is by using a library called UUID. So we can just first cd into our client, then we want to npm I UUID, and this is going to be a library we can use for creating random IDs really easily. And we can just say inside of here, we want to import this from UUID. And we want to import something called v4, and we're just going to rename this to UUID v4. So this shouldn't be from, this should be like, there we go. So we want to take that v4 function, we're just renaming it to UUID v4, just so it's easier to work with. And now we can create an on click for our button down here. So we can say on click is going to be equal to, we'll just say create new ID. And we'll create a function called create new ID. And what this function is going to do is essentially just going to call that UUID v4 function. This creates a brand new ID for us. And we're just going to say on ID submit. And we're going to pass in that new fake UUID that we just created, just brand new random UUID. So now if we click create a new ID, you can see we get a completely random ID. Do it again and again and again. And every time we're getting a brand new random ID up here. Now that's pretty much everything for our login page taken care of. So we can go back into our app. And one thing that I want to emphasize is when we refresh our page, you notice that our ID gets completely removed. We actually want this to persist when we refresh our page, when we close our browser and come back to it. We want all of that information to persist. So we're going to create a custom hook So we'll create a new folder here called hooks, and we're going to call this here use local storage.js. And essentially what this is going to do is work exactly the same as use state, but we're going to store everything in local storage so that we can come and refresh our page and all of our data is going to stay there. So again, I'm just going to use that RFC shortcut. We don't actually need React, but we do need some hooks from here. We need the use effect hook, and we also need the use state hook to actually store this information. And inside of here, we're going to take both a key as well as an initial value for our use state. So this key is going to be what we store inside of local storage, and this initial value is like what you would normally pass to use state. In our case, with this login, we don't really have anything we're passing into it for our ID here. As you can see, it's blank, but that's perfectly okay. So now back to our use local storage here. Let's get rid of all this return information down here. And what we want to do is first get our information into state locally for our application, and we need to pull it from local storage. So what I like to do when I'm working with local storage is to create some type of key called prefix, which is kind of unique to my application. So we'll say what's app clone is our prefix. And the reason that I do this is that when you have a lot of apps on local host, like localhost 3000, for example, all of your different local storage is going to conflict with each other. So you may have local storage from a different project you're working on conflicting in this project. But if you just prefix them all, you're not going to have that issue. It also makes it really easy to find it inside of your, debug menu, exactly which ones are for your own application. So now that we have that prefix, we have all of our values being passed in, let's begin by writing our code. The first thing I want to do is get our prefixed key. Essentially, I'm just going to combine our prefix with our key. So now we have our string that has our prefix at the beginning of the key we pass in. And now I want to use state, so we can just say here our value and set value is going to be equal to use state. We're going to be using the function version of use state because getting values from local storage and parsing the JSON is actually pretty slow. So we only want to do this once when we run this function. So what we want to do is get the JSON version of our value. So we'll say JSON value equals local storage.getItem, and we're going to use that prefixed key just like that. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to check if we have some data. So we'll say if the JSON value exists, then we just want to essentially return our JSON.parse of JSON value. And actually, instead of just doing this, I'm going to say if it's not equal to null, because in some instances our JSON value may be 0, and then this is going to return false if it's 0, when in reality we only want it to return false here when we have null or undefined. So now if we have something, it's going to just parse that and return it as our default value. Now, if that's not the case, we want to first check if the type of our key, so if the type of, not our key, our initial value is a function, so it's equal to the string function, then that means we're using the function version of our use state, and we want to actually just invoke that function. So we're going to return invoking that function. Otherwise, we're just passing it a normal default value, so we can just return that initial value. And right here, this is all the code we need to essentially get our value from local storage and actually put it into our state. Now, the next thing to do is actually get our value and save it into local storage. And that's where use effect comes in. Essentially, all we want to do instead of our use effect is anytime that our value changes or anytime that our key changes, so our prefixed key, anytime either of these change, we essentially need to put our value into local storage, essentially resave it, overwrite our old value. So we can say local storage.setItem. We're going to set the prefixed key, and all we want to do is take our value and stringify it, just like that. And now what we can do is return this to work just like set state. So we have value and set value. And what this is going to do is just return our two set use state values here, just like if we used a normal use state, but it has all this extra code behind the scenes to persist everything into local storage. So now in our app, here we can use local storage and make sure that we import that just like this, get rid of our use state completely. And now when we enter in an ID, like create a new one, for example, we have this random ID and we refresh, and that ID persists on our page. And that's because if we open up here, go to application, you can see we have WhatsApp clone, undefined is stored at that value. We don't want this to say undefined though. We need to pass in our key, which in our case is ID. So now if I just clear this out, create a new ID, you can see WhatsApp clone ID now has that value. And when we refresh, that value sticks around, which is exactly what we want. Now with our login page completely done, the next step that I want to work on is what I'm going to call the dashboard. It's essentially everything else in our application other than this login page, because once you have an ID, you don't need this login page at all. So now here, instead of printing out our ID, What I want to do instead is just take the ID, and I want to determine if we have an ID, then I want to go to another page. And if we don't have an ID, then I want to do this login page. So we'll copy that up here. And otherwise, I want to go to the dashboard. And this is going to be a component that we're going to create now. And I want to just pass the ID into that dashboard. We can get rid of these fragments. We don't even need these curly braces anymore since we're not in the fragments. Keep that parenthesis there though, just so we can have this on another line. And now we can create that new component, dashboard.js, RFC, and we're getting in an ID here. So all I want to do is just print out that ID just to make sure everything's working. So we're going to save this, save our app, and we should see, of course, we're getting an error. We need to import dashboard from dashboard. And now you can see that our ID is being printed out. And we don't even have the login page anymore because we already have an ID. As you can see here, our ID is coming from our local storage. So we're just rendering the dashboard page immediately. And if we just come in here, go to our application, and we just clear out our storage, refresh, you can see we're at the login page. We click create a new ID, and there we go. We have that ID being rendered. It brought us to our dashboard and closed out of the login page. Now the next step that I want to work on is going to be the sidebar that shows us our contacts, our conversations, as well as our ID, and the ability to create new contacts and new conversations is a pretty important part of the application. So let's create that sidebar component now. We'll just sidebar.js, and again, use that RFC trick. Now we have our sidebar. This is going to take in our ID because it needs to display it to the user so they actually know what ID they have so they can share it with their friends. Essentially, this is their phone number, so they need to be able to access it. Now in our dashboard, instead of here doing all of this, let's just render out our sidebar, make sure we import that up here, and we just pass in our ID just like that. So now we're rendering our sidebar inside of our dashboard, but our sidebar has nothing. We put some text in here and save, we should see that text. So we know our sidebar is at least rendering. And to create this sidebar, we're going to use something inside of Bootstrap called tabs. So from Bootstrap, we're just going to import here, tab. We're going to import a nav, and that's all we need for now. So we'll just say that's from React Bootstrap. There we go. So now with all that out of the way, all I want to do instead of here is to set up a tab container. There we go. And actually we need to make sure that this has content inside of it. And in order to make sure our tab never takes up the full width of our page, we want this to only be a sidebar. Inside of our div here, we're just going to set up a few styles. So we'll say style here is going to be a width of 250 pixels. That just will prevent it from becoming too wide. And we're also going to add a few classes here. So we'll say class name is going to be equal to dFlex, as well as flex column. This is going to allow us to easily style some stuff inside of our tab to make sure everything lines up like we want it to. So now we have our tab container. The next step is going to be creating the nav inside of it. So we'll say nav. We're going to close this off here. And this nav is going to have some items. So we'll say nav.item. And each one of these items is going to be a link. So we'll say nav.link. And these links, all they're going to do is just say, for example, conversations. And let's just copy this down. And we're going to have another one here that says contacts. And they're also going to have a few additional styles. We want them to have a key. So we're going to say event key for this one is contacts. And event key for this one is going to be equal to conversations. And this is essentially going to allow us to change between our different tabs by using these event keys. And instead of hard coding them like this, I really don't like hard coding things like this. I'm just going to create some variables. So we'll say const conversations key is equal to conversations. Copy this down, do the exact same thing for our contacts. And this right here is just going to say contacts. There we go. And now instead of hard coding those in there, we're just going to use these nice variables so we can change it all in one place. And now we have our different nav links completely done. As you can see, we have our information up here. And in order to make it look like tabs, all we need to do in our nav is change the variant to be equal to tabs. And we're also just going to set a class name here, which is going to be justify content center. And that's just going to center our tabs inside of our nav bar here. As you can see, they're in the dead center. If we got rid of this, and save, you can see that they're off to the left side. I just want them to be completely centered inside of here. But right now you'll notice neither of these are active. If I click one, it'll become active, but by default, none of them are active. So what we can do is inside of here, set our active key, and this active key is going to be equal to some kind of state we create. So we're going to create a state called active key. Let's come in here, we'll say const, active key, set active key. and that's going to be equal to use state. And by default, we're going to use conversations as our active key. And the reason I'm not storing this in local storage is because we don't need to store this information locally. It doesn't matter if this gets reset when they refresh the page. All we really care about is the main data of like IDs and conversations. This is really only pertaining to their particular instance of having this open. So now if I save, whoops, we're getting an error because we don't have use state installed here. So let's import that, use state. And there we go. Now you can see that conversations is the default tab that's open, but we can't swap tabs anymore. And that's because we need to set the ability to change tabs. So we can just say on select. That is going to be equal to that set active key function. So now when I click contacts, I can change, and I can change back to conversations. If I refresh, you can see it goes back to that default. Now the next thing to do then, and we have our nav done, let's just minimize this, is to actually work on the content inside of each one of our tabs. So we can just say tab.content, content, and this is going to be all of the information from when we click on our tabs. And then in order to determine which tab is which, we can say tab.pane, and we just set an event key. So the event key for this one is going to be our conversations key. Close that off. And inside of here, we're just going to render our conversations component, which we'll create in a little bit. We'll just say conversation, close that off like this, and we'll create a new component for that, conversations.js. Do that nice little RFC trick, and we'll just say conversations inside of here so we know which component this is. Save that, save this, make sure we import that. So we'll say import conversations from /conversations. And while we're at it, let's create our contacts.js component. Essentially the exact same thing, but this will say contacts inside of it. So now inside of that sidebar that we are working on, let's just copy this tab pane down, but instead of conversations, we're going to have contacts, and our event key here is going to be our contacts key, and we need to import contacts so we actually have that component. So now if we save, you see conversations on this tab, and we click over here, now we get our contacts tab, and we can swap between the two of them. Now I do want to add a little bit of styling to our tabs just to make them look a little bit better. So we'll say class name here is going to be equal to border right, and we're going to set the overflow here to auto, as well as the flex grow to 1. So what all of this does is, as you can see, we now have this little white sidebar showing up here, our little border on the right, and what the border right is doing is that the overflow auto means if we have a ton of things inside of here, our scroll bar is going to be inside of this container instead of overflowing to our entire page scrolling, because we don't want to scroll our entire page to look through our conversations. We just want to scroll our sidebar. And flex grow is just going to make it so that this tab is actually growing inside of our container. One problem you'll notice though is this is actually not growing. As you can see by our border should extend all the way down to the bottom of our page if this flex grow is working. And the reason this flex grow is not working is because right now this sidebar does not fill our entire height of our page. So let's change that. We'll create a div here with a class name, which is just going to be dflex to make this flex box. And we're also going to change our style here, and this is going to be height. And it's going to be 100, 100, if I can type, 100 VH. Close that off. We're going to wrap our sidebar inside of this. Now if we save, you can see our sidebar is inside this container that takes up 100% of the height. So now our flex grow is filling this entire space over here on the left-hand side of our screen. The reason we added this deflex here is because eventually we're going to have content on the right-hand side of our page, and it's going to be really easy to style that if we're using Flexbox. Now back into our sidebar, we only have a few things left to add. The first thing that I want to add is going to be a section that tells us what our ID is. So we'll say your ID, and we're going to have a span inside of here that's going to actually say our ID, like that. And we're just going to add a little bit of styling. We'll say class name here is equal to text muted, just so it's kind of this grayish color. If we save, you'll see our ID is down here. It's got that nice little gray color for our text. And also inside of this div, let's do a few extra styles. So we'll say class name is equal to p-2. We're going to say border on the top, as well as a border on the right. And we're going to change the text to small just so it doesn't stand out too much. And as you can see, it decreased our font size and added those borders to really make this section stand out. Now the last thing to do is add in a button for creating our new contact as well as our new conversation. So let's create our button here. And inside of here, we're going to have some text. It's going to say new, and then we either need to say conversation or contact. And right now we don't really have a good way to do that other than by using this active key. So what we can say here is just const contact open is going to be equal to, and we just want to say, actually let's do conversation open, and that's going to be equal to active key. And if it's equal to our conversations key, that'll be true. Otherwise, conversations open is going to be false. So now we can say if our conversations is open, we want this to say conversation. Otherwise, we want it to say contact. So now, if I just save real quick, and of course, make sure we import button. Now you can see that we have our new conversation button at the bottom here, and we swap over to contacts, it says new contact instead. So in order to style this a little better though, let's just come in here and add some class names. For example, we'll say rounded is going to be 0. Now you can see we have no rounding around our corners, which just makes this fit that space a little better. Now the final thing, yes, finally the final thing we need to work on in this sidebar is going to be creating a modal for when we create a new conversation and a new contact. So let's import modal up here from Bootstrap, and outside of our tab container, we're going to create a modal, and this modal is essentially going to have two modals in it. It's going to be either our conversation modal for creating a new conversation, or our conversion or our conversation modal for creating a new conversation. So we can just say here, if conversations is open, then we're going to do our conversation modal. So let's just come in here and say new conversation modal, just like that. Make sure this is self-closing just so it takes up a little bit less space. And at the end of that, put our colon here, and we're going to do the exact same thing, but this is going to be for our new contacts modal. So we'll say new contact modal. And of course, we haven't created these components yet, so let's just create a new conversation modal. Oops, let me just expand this so we can see what we're typing. Modal.js, and the exact same thing, new contact modal.js. And again, RFC on both of these, and we'll save them RFC, and there we go. So now we have both of those modals essentially created. That way we just don't get any errors from React, as long as we make sure to import our new conversation modal. Well, this one's our contact from / new contact modal, and the exact same thing here for new conversation modal. Whoops, conversation modal. And there we go. Now we essentially have our modals imported, and all we need to do is have a show here. This is going to be for whether or not true false if our modal is open. So we're just going to create a variable called modal open, and on hide, we're going to create here a close modal function. So we essentially need some state for this again. We'll just come up here and say const, what do we call it, modal open, and set modal open is going to be equal to use state. And by default, this is going to be false because we don't want our modal to be open when we start our application. And then also we're just going to create a function called close modal. And all this is going to do is set modal open to false. So now down here, we can pass that close modal in here. We'll also pass it to each one of our modals themselves because we're going to need the ability to close it with an X button inside of each of our modals. We'll just copy that, put it on both of these. And now when we save, and we click new conversation, you'll notice nothing is actually happening. And the reason for that is we haven't hooked up our button to do anything yet. So we need to say on click, what we want to do is take our modal and we want to set it to be open. So we're just going to say here, set modal open to true. So now if we click down here, you can see it opened up our modal. Obviously there's nothing in it right now though. So let's just do our contact modal first. If you remember, we have a close modal function being passed into here. And in order to use our modal, let's just make sure we import modal. We want to get that from React. And what we can do instead of a return here is return our modal information. So first, since this is already inside of a modal, we're just going to do a fragment. And then we want to have our modal.header. This is going to be the top portion of our modal. And inside of here, we can just say create contact. And we also want to make sure that this has a close button. So now we're getting an error, and it looks like it's because here I didn't put React Bootstrap. So now if we save, you can see that if we go to contacts and we click new contact, you can see it says create contact and it has a close button for us, which is exactly what we want. Now next we can work on the body of our modal. So we'll say modal.body, close that off. And in here, as you guessed, we're going to have a form. So let's import form, and we're of course going to need a button to submit that form. So let's just import that while we're at it. So let's create the form, and we'll say on submit is going to be equal to handle submit, which is a function we'll create up here. Function handle submit And this is going to take in our event, event. And by default, we just want to prevent our default. And we'll fill in the rest of this function as we get going, but we actually need to create the actual fields for our form. So we're going to do form.group. And inside of here, we're going to have a form.label. And this first label is going to be for our ID. And it's going to have a control. So we'll say form.control. Make that self-closing. The type for this is text. And we're again just going to use refs here. So we'll say ref is equal to ID ref. And it's going to be required. We can copy this down, paste it again. And this is going to be for the name of our new contact. And we use a different ref called name ref. So now let's come up here, get use ref. And we just want to say const ID ref equals use ref. And the exact same thing for our name ref. So now if we save, we hopefully shouldn't get any errors. And if we open up our contact modal, you can see we have our ID field and our name field, and we can change these as we see fit. Now the next thing to do is actually create a button to submit our form. That's as simple as just creating a button with the type of submit. And we just want to say create in that button. Now when we click on our new contact, you can see we have a create button here. Obviously this doesn't do anything when we click on it, because right now all we're doing is preventing the default and nothing else. So inside of here, instead what we want to do is we want to call some function for creating our contact. We want to pass in our current ID value, and we want to pass in our current name value, just like that. And then of course we'll close our modal when we're done, because we don't need the modal open anymore. But we don't have this create contact function yet, so I'm just going to comment this out for now. And let's just make sure everything else works. We click new, we type in some information, and we click create, and you can see it closes the modal for us. And if we had the ability to create a contact, it would do that as well. So now our next logical step is to create this create contact function. And instead of creating this function up in the app, for example, and then passing it down to the dashboard, and then we got to pass it into the sidebar, and then we have to pass it into this modal here, I hate doing that. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to create a context. So let's just create a folder called context, because we're going to have a few in this application. We're going to create a new file, and this one's just going to be called contact context.js. We're actually call it contacts, because this is for storing all of our contacts. And inside of here, we're going to create essentially a custom context. And I have an entire video where I show this type of architecture for creating context. I'll link it in the cards and description if you're interested, but I'll go through it here as well. So the first thing we need to do is I'll just do RFC to get our boilerplate React information done. But we don't want this to be a default export. We're just going to make this a normal export. And then we also want to make sure in here we have use context being imported, use context. There we go. And we just down here need to create our context. We'll call it contacts context. We're going to set it equal to react.create context, just like that. And you'll notice that these names are actually clashing. So instead, I'm going to change this to contacts provider, because this is actually going to be the provider for our context. And down here, I'm going to change this to contacts provider as well. There we go. That way we just don't have any name clashes going on. And now what we can do inside this context provider, we're going to take in children, since this is going to be a React component that we render. So it's going to take in some children. And here, all I want to do is take our context right here. I want to get the provider from it on both the top and the bottom. And all I want to do is render out the children inside of it. So this is just a fancy way for us to easily render out our context provider and the value inside of it, which in our case, our value here is going to be equal to a object, and this object is going to store our contacts, as well as a function called create contact, which is what we need inside of this new contact modal right here, this create contact function. So how are we going to get this information? Well, it's going to be as simple as actually just creating some state. So we can say const contacts set contacts. It's going to be equal to use, and we're going to use local storage this time. Make sure it's imported up here. And this is going to take in our contacts. And by default, this is just going to be an empty array of contacts, since we'll start out with none. So now we have our contacts and the ability to set them. So let's create a simple function for creating a contact. In this function, all it's going to do is take an ID and a name, and it's going to set our contacts by using our previous contacts. And all we want to do is just append this to the end. So we can just say return all of our previous contacts spread out, and we want to get the ID and the name, put those into a new contact object, and add it to the end of this list. So this is creating our contact, this is our list of contacts, and we have access to both of those inside of this provider. Now all we have left to do is another export. This one's going to be a function called use contacts. And this is just going to be a really nice quick shorthand for actually using our contacts. So we can say use context, context, and we're going to pass in our contacts context, just like that. So now inside of our new contacts modal, we can just use this function, use contacts. So up here, let's just make sure we import that. So we'll import use contacts from /context / contacts. And now here we can say const const, and we want to get our create contact function is going to be equal to that use contacts function. We're just abstracting that out from our context. And again, if this seems confusing, make sure to check out my video linked in the cards in the description for how to do all of this information explained in depth. Now we can uncomment this here because we have that function created. And that's essentially everything that we need. But of course, we're running into a problem. It says user context is not defined. So inside of here, looks like I just spelled the use context wrong, but save. And now you can see that that's working properly, but we're going to get some problems when we try to create a new context. You can see immediately here, cannot destructure property, create context of object. And the reason for this is we're not actually providing our context. Right here, we have the using of it, but we're not using this provider here. So in order to do that, we need to wrap our dashboard inside of that provider. So I'm just going to create a variable here called dashboard. And all I want to do is wrap it inside of that contacts provider. And then I'm going to render out our dashboard with the ID being passed to it. Just like that. And we'll just make this self-closing so it's a little bit shorter. And again, make sure that we import our contacts provider. And that's coming from /context / contacts provider. And now we can just come down here and render that dashboard variable. So now we've wrapped our dashboard in this contacts provider, and this contacts provider here has access to both our contacts and the create contact function. So now here we can actually create our contact and it will create it. But right now we're not rendering our context to the page. So let's make sure that we do that first. So inside of our contacts here, we just can come in and we can say const contacts is equal to use contacts. Make sure that it gets imported at the top, just like that. This gives us access to our contacts, and now we can loop through them. And again, we're going to use some handy components from Bootstrap. So we can just say list group. We're going to import that from, React Bootstrap. And now here, instead of a div, we can use a list group. Close that off down there. And we're going to make this list group variant be equal to flush. That's just going to get rid of the side borders on the left and right, since we already have our own left and right borders. Now inside of here, let's just loop through our contacts. Say contacts.map, and we have a contact. And for each one of these, we just want to put them inside of a list group.item. And of course, we need to set a key. So we're going to set our key here to be contact.id, since we shouldn't have any duplicate contacts. And then in here, we're just going to say contact.name to render out the contact's name. And of course, we're getting an error. It says expecting an assignment or function call, and instead saw an expression. The reason for that here is I'm not actually returning anything from this function. We just changed these curly braces here to normal parentheses. That'll make it so it returns everything in here. And now you can see we're rendering our contacts, which we have none. So let's create a new one. We're just going to give this one an ID of 123 and a name of test. Click create, and now you can see we have our contact right here. Let's create another one. We'll say the ID is 456. The name is test2. And now we have two separate contacts right here to work with. We are finally starting to get somewhere because now if I refresh this, our contacts are saved. So we have our contacts being stored. We have the ability to create new contacts. We can log in. The only real step left is to be able to create a conversation between our different contacts. So let's work on that next. That's going to be inside of our conversation modal. For this modal, we're going to do very similar things to what we did for our new contact modal here. I'm actually just going to copy a lot of this to start with, just so we have a good place to start. Paste that in and make sure that we import modal, and we want to get that from React Bootstrap. There we go. And we also are going to need form. So we'll import that as well, and a button. Make sure I spell everything correctly. There we go. So this is going to say create conversation instead. And now we're going to have our form, but instead of having our form groups for these different pieces of information, instead, we're going to loop through our contacts and place them as checkboxes. So we're going to say context.map, We're going to loop through each one of our individual contacts. And again, we're going to use that parentheses trick to just automatically return whatever is inside of here. And in order to get our contacts, we can use that same context that we created here, this contacts provider, inside of our conversation modal. So we can just import contacts. We want to get it from that, what is it, / context / contacts provider. Now we have access to all of our different contacts. Let's just make sure this is capitalized correctly. There we go. Now we're accessing that from this context. So now inside of here, what we can do is create a form.group. And this form group is going to have a control ID, which is equal to our contact.id. And we're going to do the same thing with our key, contact.id. And inside of this form group, we're going to be using a checkbox. So we'll say form.check. I'm just going to set this on another line because there's quite a lot of information we need to pass to this. The first thing we need to pass is the type. In our case, we're doing a checkbox. So we'll say checkbox. We also need to say the value of this. And the value of this is going to be true or false, depending on if we've already selected this current ID. So we are going to have a list of selected contact IDs. And we're going to see if that includes our current contact ID. So we need to create some kind of state to store this information. So we'll just come up here, const selected contact IDs, set selected contact IDs, and that's going to be equal to a new use state. And we'll just default this to an empty array. Let's make sure that we import that, use state. There we go. That way we actually have this information. Now we have our value being set. Our label, we already know is just going to be the name of our contact. So we can just set that equal to contact.name. And then lastly, what do we want to do when we actually change this? So we'll say on change, and we're just going to call a function called handle checkbox change, and we're going to pass it in our contact.id. So we know which contact we're working with. And again, let's create that function up here, handle checkbox change, and it's going to take in an ID. We're just going to make sure this is our contact ID. So now what we want to do inside of here is we're going to say set selected contact IDs, previous selected contact IDs. And all we want to do is determine if our contact ID we have here is already in the list. So we'll say if previous selected contact IDs dot includes contact ID. So if it already includes it, we want to remove it. So we're going to return a new list that doesn't have that anymore. So we're going to filter out based on our previous ID, and we're going to check if our previous ID is equal to our contact ID. So we can say here, previous ID is equal to that, previous ID. And what this is going to do, if we say not equals here, is it's going to essentially remove every single one, or I'm sorry, it's going to keep all of our IDs that are not equal to this contact ID, and it's going to remove the one equal to that ID. So essentially it's allowing us to remove it from the list. And in order to add it to the list, it's as simple as just doing here a simple return, if I can spell correctly, and we want to take our currently selected IDs and add on that new ID like that. And here, I made a mistake. This should not be contacts up here. This should be use contacts. And then we need to get our contacts by actually extracting from that use contacts function, just like that. So now if we save, we're of course getting an error. It says ID is not defined and handle submit is not defined. And here, this should be previous ID. I'm sorry, not previous ID. It should be contact ID. And we have this handle submit function here we never created. So let's create that handle submit function. It's going to take in an event. Whoops. And we want to just make sure we prevent the default of that. And at the end, we want to close our modal. And if you remember correctly, we passed that in as the prop here. So we'll get that from our props. And now, just like with our contact, we need to create a conversation. And this conversation is going to be based on our selected contact IDs. So we're going to import use conversations. And we're going to get that from / context / conversations provider. And this is going to be very similar to our contacts provider up here. So we're going to get that create conversation from our use conversations. And now all we need to do is actually create that conversations provider. So just like our context provider, let's create it. We'll create a new file, conversations provider.js. And I'm really just going to copy everything from here and paste it into here because it's going to be very similar. We're going to have a conversations context. Just going to rename some of these. We're going to have here conversations. So here it's going to be conversations context, and this will say conversations provider. And this is going to take in our children. And instead of here having context, we're going to have conversations, and we're going to have a function for setting those conversations. And we'll just make sure we change our key here to conversations so we can store it in our local storage. And this function here, we can do create conversation. And this isn't taking an ID and a name, instead is taking our recipients essentially. So we'll say recipients. These are our IDs that we selected earlier. And now we can set our conversations. We're going to get our previous conversations. We're going to spread that out here. And down here, we're going to get all of our recipients, and we're going to place these in here. And we're also going to default our messages to be an empty array, because when you create a new conversation, obviously you have no messages yet. And now here we can do conversations context on the top and the bottom. And here we can pass in our conversations, as well as down here we can say create conversation. And that should be all of the changes we need to make over here. Let's just refresh and see we're getting an error, cannot resolve component/conversations provider. So let's just go over to that new conversations modal. This should say context, just like that. Let's see if that fixes it. There we go, it does. If we click new conversation, we're of course getting an error, cannot get create conversation from our use conversations. So clearly something's going wrong inside of our conversations provider. And let's go over to that. And actually the reason for that is that in our app here, we're not actually outputting our conversations provider. So we want to get our conversations provider, make sure we import it up here, and do the exact same thing that we did with our context provider. That should get rid of that error. And now when we click new conversation, you can see we can select our different people up here, and we can click create and it'll create it for us. But before we do that, we need to actually display our conversation. So let's just create a conversation between test and test2. Obviously, it's not going to show up yet, but it's there for us to know about. Now, in order to make working with our conversations a lot easier, what I want to do inside of our conversations provider is actually export a formatted version of this. So I can say const formatted conversations like this. I'm going to set this equal to our conversations.map. And I essentially just want to go through all of our conversations. So we'll say conversation. And for each one of them, I want to format it in a proper way that makes it easier to work with. Essentially, right now, all we have are the IDs of our contacts being stored inside of our recipients here. And I want to also store the name of our recipients. So we can say const recipients is equal to conversation.recipients.map. So now we're mapping over all the recipients for a single conversation. And for each one of our recipients, this is just an ID. All we want to do is convert this to an object that has an ID and a name. So we want to get the contact for that recipient, which is just going to be equal to contacts.find. And we want to find for an individual contact based on the contact ID being equal to the recipient, because this recipient is just an ID. So if these IDs match, then we will find a contact. But first we need to import our contacts. So to do that, we can just say const contacts is equal to use contacts. And again, make sure that this gets imported up here. And of course, now we have our contacts and we have access to them. Make sure I spell that correctly. Use contacts, there we go. And now we have our contact, so let's get our name. Our name is just going to be equal to, if we have a contact, so I'll say contact and contact.name. This will return the name if there is a contact. Otherwise, if there's not a contact, we just want to get the ID, which in our case is our recipient. Then finally, with all that done, we can return a new object, which has the ID, which is equal to recipient, and it has our name property, which is either our contact.name or it defaults back to our recipient. And now we have our recipients. So down here, inside of our formatted conversations loop, we can just return a new object that has everything about our conversation, but we're replacing our recipients with this new formatted version of our recipients that includes the name as well as the ID instead of just a list of IDs. This again will just make it much, much easier to work with. So now here, our conversations is actually going to be set to our formatted conversations. And to make this easier, I'm just going to create a variable called output. Actually, I'll just create a variable called value. So this is going to have conversations, which is equal to formatted conversations. and we're going to have our create conversation. So now here, we'll just set this to value. It just makes it easier to read, well formatted. We save, and over here, so far we don't have any errors. So now let's display our conversations. That's going to be done inside of our conversations component. I'm again doing something very similar to what we did for context. So let's just copy this all over, paste this in here, and we need to make sure we import these components. So we're going to need our list group from React Bootstrap. Whoops. React Bootstrap, there we go. We have our list group being imported inside of here. And instead of conversation, or instead of contacts, we want conversations. Make sure that's a lowercase, and this should say conversation. And this here, our key, we don't actually have a conversation ID. So instead, we're just going to use the index because we know the order of our conversations is not going to change. So here, instead of the ID, we're just going to use simply the index. And let's make sure we actually get our conversations, I'm sorry. So we'll say conversations is equal to use conversations. Make sure that gets imported up here. And there we go. Now we have access to our conversations. We have our conversation, and we just need to make sure we actually place our conversation information inside of here. So let's just do inside of brackets, conversation.recipients.map. And all we want to do is map all of our different recipients to their name. So we can say recipient, and all we want to do is get the recipient. We'll actually just call this r.name. So if I just change this variable to r, this variable to r, makes it a little bit easier to save on space. And we want to join those by a comma and a space. So it's going to take all of the names from the recipients that we just created inside of our conversation provider here with this nice mapping. And it's just going to display those names in a comma-oriented list. So if I save, you can see it says test, comma, test2. If we create a new conversation with just test, it'll just say test here. So we're showing our different conversations. So now we have pretty much our entire sidebar complete. We can create conversations, we can create contacts, we can view them, we can do all of that. But something we're missing is the ability to select a conversation in order to open it up on the right side of our screen, the main side of our screen. So let's add that ability here. We're going to do that inside of our list item. And nice thing about Bootstrap is we can really easily make these selectable by putting action on here. This is going to make them have styling to be selectable. And also we're going to put active, and we're going to set that equal to conversation, conversation, I cannot spell, conversation.selected. We're going to add that inside of our conversation provider here, and we're going to have an on click. And this on click, all it is going to do is it's just going to take in here a function called select conversation index. We're going to pass it the current index of our conversation that we want to select. And this function, we're going to take from use conversations up here. Because this use conversations, we can easily export a function called select conversation index. And if I just make sure I spell that correctly, select conversation index, there we go. So now inside of our conversation provider, let's do all of that extra work. So what we're going to do, just scroll up here a little ways, we're going to create some state. We're going to say const selected conversation index and set selected conversation index. It's going to be equal to use state. And by default, we're just going to select the very first conversation if we have one. We'll just use state for this. And now we have the ability to select our conversation as well as figure out which one is selected. So down here, we can just pass our select, conversation index. That's just going to be equal to set selected conversation index. We're just mapping this to a different name to make it easier to work with. And now inside of here, when we format our conversations, let's figure out if it's selected or not. We can say const selected is going to be determining if we get our index from up here. There we go. We're going to just check if our index is equal to the selected conversation index. If it's true, then it's selected. And we can pass that here into our new conversation. So now we have our names for our recipients and a true false Boolean for if this is selected or not. And if we save, we're of course getting an error. Why wouldn't we? Let's scroll up here, get rid of these parentheses. Don't know why I put that there. And now you can see that our selection here is our very first one. We can click our second one, and now that's selected. And just by default, when we refresh our page, it always is going to be selecting our first conversation if we have one. Another thing I want to export from here is our current selected conversation. So we can say selected conversation is going to be equal to formatted conversations of the actual selected conversation index. This is just getting our selected conversation to be used at a later point because we need to display that selected conversation on the right-hand side of our screen. So now that we have our sidebar 100% complete, let's work on this right-hand side of our screen, which is what happens when we select a conversation. We're going to create a new component, called open conversation.js, and this is essentially going to be the entire right-hand side of our screen, our open conversation. So now in our dashboard, let's make sure we render that out. Right now we have our sidebar being rendered. We also want to render out this open conversation. Let's just close that off, make it self-closing, and we only want to render this if we have a currently selected conversation. So we can just say const selected conversation is going to be equal to use conversations. Use conversations, make sure that gets imported. And now we can just say if selected conversation, then we want to render this out. So we're just using a nice short circuiting trick to say if we have a selected conversation, then render our open conversation. So now with that done, let's go into this open conversation here and get to work on all of this right-hand information, which is going to include all of our messages back and forth, as well as a form for submitting our own new messages. This is going to be quite a bit of involved work. So we're going to start down here with the actual styling portion just to get our grasp. So the first thing I want to do is make sure this takes up 100% of the width of the screen. So an easy way to do that is we can just say class name here. It's going to be flexbox because we want to be able to change the size of things inside of here. We want this to be column because we want our messages to stack on top of our actual text box. And then we set the flex grow here to 1, and that's going to make this right-hand side fill the full height because it's stuck inside of this dashboard, which has display flex. So we'll save all that information, and we have all this. And let's just put open convo here, just so we can see that this is printing, as you can see right here. Now the next thing that we want to do is going to be a section for our messages. And we're not actually going to fill this out completely. We're just going to make it essentially a placeholder for now, since we don't have any messages. We're going to set the flex grow on this to 1 because we want our messages to fill up the most amount of space. And we want the overflow to be set to auto because we want it to be able to scroll independently of our entire page. If we have thousands of messages, we don't want to scroll our page from the very top all the way past all 1,000 messages to get all the way down to the scroll bar. We just want to scroll this one section so that we can get to our input down here much easier. And that's all I want to do for this section so far, because the meat of what we need to work on is our form for actually sending messages before we can display them. So of course, in comes Bootstrap. We're going to get form from Bootstrap, React-Bootstrap. And here we're just going to render out a form. Make sure I spell form properly. There we go. And inside of this form, it's going to be rather simple. We really only have one input. So we're going to create a form group. Just like that. And inside this form group, I'm actually going to create an input group. And the reason for this is that I want to have our send button attached to our input. So let's just make sure we get import group from here. There we go. And inside of here, I'm going to have our form.control. This is going to be as a text area because we want this to be multi-line possibly if they need to send a message like that. We're going to set the required on this. And our value is going to be equal to this text state that we're going to create. And let's just put all of this on some new lines so it's easier to see. Oops, there we go. Value. Close this off. We're also going to have an onChange on here. This onChange is just going to be taking in an event, and this is just going to call the setText function from our state that we're going to create in a little bit. And we're going to set the target value. And then finally, we're going to have some styling in here. And all I want to do is set the height. Oops. Put this in an object. The height is going to be 75 pixels, just so it's a little bit bigger. And we'll make it so that the resize on this is none, since we don't want the user actually changing the size of this text box. Now let's create that state up here. We can say const text and setText is equal to use state. And by default, we're just going to have this be an empty string. And we're going to get use state here from React. And if you save, you should see that there's actually no error showing up. And we have our text box down here, which is exactly what we want. Now, in order to space it out so it's not pressed right up against our sidebar, let's just take our form group here and add a class of M2. This is just going to give us margin on all sides. And as you can see, that makes it fit into this space much better. And my camera is probably in the way, so let me just move my camera over to here for now. There we go. And the next thing that we want to do is to add in a button. So we can do this at the bottom of our input group here. And this is going to be an input group dot append. This is going to add it to the end. And we need to make sure we import button. So up here, make sure we have button in there. And then we want to set the type of this to submit. And the value is just send. So now if we save, you can see we have our send button being added onto our text area, which is what this input group is used for. Now the next step is going to be handling the submit of our form. So we'll say on submit is equal to handle submit. And let's create this function up above. Function handle submit. It's going to take in that event. And just like always, we want to prevent the default of that. Now inside of here, we need to call a function called send message, which we're actually going to get from our conversations. So we're going to say const send message is equal to use conversations. Make sure it imports at the top, just like that. And this we're going to create in just a little bit. So we're going to send message, and we need to first determine the recipients this message is going to go to. So we're going to say selected conversation, which we can again pull from here. So we'll say selected conversation. We want to get the recipients, and we want to just get the IDs. So we're going to say recipient, and we want to get the ID. We'll just change this to be R instead of recipient. So R and R. So now we essentially have, our recipients being passed into our send message function. The next thing we need to send into this function is the text that we're actually going to send, and that text just comes from this state here. And then we can set our text to an empty string, clearing it out after we send our message. So when we send our message down here, click send, it'll clear everything we sent inside of our text box, so we can go ahead and send another message immediately. But now we need to create this send message function. So let's jump into our conversations provider and work on that function. Let's come in here and we're just going to create a function called add message to conversation. And this is going to take in a few different parameters. We're going to have our recipients, we're going to have our text, as well as the person that actually sent the message, the sender. And the reason we're creating this function here separate with all these different parameters is because this is actually going to be a message that gets called both from our server when someone sends us a message, as well as when we send a message to other people. So we need to make sure this is flexible enough to support taking messages from others, as well as taking our own messages. And then we can create that send message function, which takes in our recipients as well as our text. And really all this is going to do is call the add message to conversation. It's going to pass in our recipients, it's going to pass in our text, and the sender is just going to be our own current ID. And I believe this ID we need to pass into here because we don't actually have an ID yet. So we're going to pass it in as a prop to our conversations provider. So inside of our app, where we have our conversations provider, let's just make sure we take our ID and we pass that in as a prop. So now inside of here, our conversations provider, we have access to that ID, which we can set as our sender when we call add message to conversation. Then we can take send message down here, and we can just export that out with all of our other information inside this value object. So now our send message is available for us. We just need to actually implement it through this add message to conversation function. Now this function seems like it should be really straightforward, but it's actually a little bit complex because all we have is an array of recipients, and we need to figure out what conversation that goes to, or if we need to create a brand new conversation since we don't have those recipients yet. So let's call the set conversations method and get our previous conversations. And the first thing that we need to do is determine if we've actually made any changes. So we'll say let made change equal false. And the reason for this is so that we can determine if we have a conversation that matches one of the recipients here. If we don't have a conversation that matches, this will be false, and we can add a new conversation at the end. So we can just say if made change is equal to false, we'll just actually make it here true. So we'll say else. So essentially if made change is false, we didn't have a conversation that matches, so we need to add a new one. So we'll take our previous conversations, we're going to create a new one that has those recipients, and the messages, instead of being an empty array, is just going to be an array that has our new message inside of it. So let's create that new message variable. New message. That's just going to be equal to an object that has our sender as well as our text. And we can put this on two separate lines here. just like this to make it easier to read. So as you can see, we're taking all of our current conversations and adding our new one if we didn't make any changes, which means that we didn't have any conversations that matched. So like I said, that was the easy part. So now we need to move on to the hard part, which is going to be actually modifying this array to see if we have a conversation that matches these recipients. So we can just create a new variable called const new conversations. We're going to set that equal to our previous conversations.map through each one of our conversations. And inside of here, we need to check to see if our recipients array matches the recipients array of each individual conversation. So if we're going to call a function called array equality, which we're going to create. And this function is just taking two arrays and it's going to see if they're the same. So we're going to take our conversation recipients as well as our own recipients. And if these are equal, what we're going to do inside of here is we're going to say made changes is true. And we're also going to just return here a new version of our conversation, which spreads out all of our current properties, but it's also going to take our messages and add that message to the end. And again, I'm going to put this on a separate line just to make it easier to read. So it's going to take our conversation.messages, spread all those out, and it's going to add in our new message to the very end of it. So essentially, we're adding to that message to the end of our list, or we're creating a new conversation with just that message in it. So that's all we need to do in this if statement. Otherwise, if that's not true, we're just going to return our conversation as is, so we don't have to worry about it. Now with this new conversation down here, we can just return that if we did end up making changes. So now the last thing to implement is this array equality function. I'm just going to do this all the way down here outside of our component, because it doesn't depend on anything in our component. This is just going to take a and b, two different arrays. And essentially all we can do is say if a dot length is not equal to b dot length. Well, immediately we know that this is false, they're not equal, so we can just return false. Otherwise, we need to sort them both. So we'll sort A, we're going to sort B, and then we're going to just loop through all the elements of A. So A dot every element and index. We want to check if every element is equal to the element inside of B. So if element is equal to B of index. Essentially, this means, is every element in A equal to every single element in B at the exact same index position? If so, our arrays are exactly equal, and it doesn't matter about ordering, which is why we did this sorting first. So now, with all of that taken care of, this hopefully should add a message to a conversation based on recipients. And we should be able to type down here, click send, and it should add that message to it. Let's just make sure we inspect here, go to our application, and if we check our conversations, and I make this a little larger, you can see inside of our first one, we have messages, and our message has a sender, which is our own ID. You can see this matches our ID down here, and it also has the text that we typed in. So now we can work on displaying our messages. And just like we did with recipients down here, I want to make a nice human formatted version that is allowing us to easily see the name of the person as well as to determine if we sent this message or if someone else sent it. So we can just come down, we can say const messages. I'm just going to do a little bit of neat spacing here to make this a little easier to read. It's going to be equal to conversation.messages.map over each one of our messages. And of course, spell message correctly. There we go. Now we can get our contact. This is essentially exactly the same as what we have up here. I'm just going to copy this word for word. And instead of here being equal to our recipient, we want to check if it's equal to our message.sender. And then down here, instead of doing our recipient, this is message.sender. So now if we have a contact that is equal to our sender, we know that it's this particular contact. Otherwise, we're going to set the name equal to our message.sender, which is just the ID of the person that sent it. It's our fallback. Lastly, I want to have a from me section. And all I'm doing here is checking if I am the one that sent it. So if the sender ID is equal to my own ID, I know I sent this. So I have this from me flag that's set to true. Now here I can return all of the message information, but I want to take a new property called sender name, and I want to set that to the name, and I want to get that from me property and also add that to our message. So now when we access our messages, if we make sure to put this inside of here, there we go. So now when we actually access our messages, we should be able to access the sender name as well as the from me property, which originally were not there. So now, all the way back to our open conversations, we can dive into this section, which is displaying all of our messages. Let's minimize this form section, and we can come in here create a div. And this div is actually going to have quite a few classes on it. This is like the wrapper for all of our messages. So we'll say class name here is h100. We want this section to take up 100% of the height that's remaining in our screen. Then we can set this to deflex, flex column, since we want to stack these vertically on top of each other. We're going to align our items in the center. I'm sorry, not the center, the start. What that's going to do is put all of our messages on the left-hand side of our screen. And we want to justify our content on the end. And what that's going to do is start our messages at the very bottom, and they'll work their way upwards. And then finally, we'll just add a little bit of padding on the left and the right of 3, just to space it away from our sidebar on the left and the right. Now we can get inside of this div and actually display our different messages. So we can say selected conversation dot messages. Let's map through each one of those messages along with the index. Since our messages don't have any form of unique ID, we can say const. And now inside of here, we need our return statement. And this return statement is going to have a div. And this div is going to essentially be our first div that wraps our message. So this div is going to be the one that contains our key. We're going to put our key as our index, since we don't have any unique, ID that we can use for this instead. Also, we're going to set some class names to this. We're going to say that our class names is going to be my1. We're going to want dflex on here and flex column, again, in order to stack these vertically, because this is going to wrap our message bubble as well as the name of the person that sends the message. This is our wrapper for both of those pieces of content. And in order to clarify that a little further, let's have our div which has our message.text right here. We're also going to have another div, and this one is going to have our message name. So we can first check if it's from me, because if it's from me, we just want to say you. And otherwise, we want to put the actual name. So we'll say message.sender name. There we go. And we'll put this on a new line just to make it easier to read. There we go. Same thing with up here. We'll do a new line for all of these. I think it just makes it easier to work with. So this is our wrapper around these two different pieces of information, just like this. And this is going to put our message on the left-hand side. Let's add a few more styles to get our message looking really good. So we can say here we want rounded px2. That's going to give us a nice round shape that has a little bit of padding on the top and the bottom. And here py1 is for top bottom, px for left and right. And to determine what color we want this to be, we're actually going to check our from me variable. So instead, I'm going to use string interpolation here instead of the normal string, because I want to have a essentially inline if statement here. I'm going to put this on another line. Whoops, there we go. So essentially, I want to, inside of here, say if message.fromMe is true, then I want the background to be our primary color, and I want our text to be white. Otherwise, if it's not, I just want to have a simple border, so no background color at all. So it's just going to be a nice white border instead. And then for down here, our text, what we want to do for this is class name. And I'm again going to do string interpolation. We want it to be muted, so it's kind of this gray color. We want it to be small, so it doesn't really stick out. And then if it's from me, what we want to do is just set the text to be on the right-hand side. Otherwise, we don't do anything. So let's just save that to kind of see what we have. And of course, we're getting an error saying it cannot get this token. This is on the line for our selected conversation up here. And the reason for that is that we just have an extra parenthesis here. If we remove that and save, we're now getting a different error down here. And let's just see if our parentheses are lining up. It looks like we have an extra bracket and we're missing our parenthesis here. So now if we save, in the wrong order. Now if we save, put our extra parenthesis here, and our extra bracket there. There we go. So it should go bracket, parenthesis, bracket. Now we save. We're getting our information, and you can see our messages showing up right here. But of course, it doesn't look like our message from me is working. Obviously, I just typed from here. This should be from me. That's giving us that nice blue color, which is exactly what we want. But this message is on the left-hand side. Generally, when you're in a messaging app, the messages you send are on the right. So what we want to do is put it on the right-hand side. So again, that's going to be more of this string interpolation. So we can say message.fromMe. And what I want to do here is align self end. And then I just want to come in here with an empty string for the rest. And now if I save, you can see that it's going to put this all the way on the end, which is exactly what I want. Now if we send a new message, you can see that message pops up on our screen. And if we send a bunch of messages, you're going to start to notice something happens. Just keep sending these messages. And here we go. We don't have any way to scroll, so clearly there's something wrong with our application right now. This is because we have this H100 up here. If we just remove this and save, you can now see that we have this scroll bar, but when we type in a new message, click send, it doesn't scroll us to that message, so it stays hidden. If we're all the way up here, type new message, click send, we don't get scrolled down to that message. So let's actually go ahead and fix that. It's fairly simple to fix actually. What we need to do is create a reference that's going to reference our last message. So we can say const last message ref is equal to use ref, and make sure we get that up here. Use ref. We're also going to need use effect for this, so let's just import that while we can. So we have our last message ref, and then we're going to create a use effect. And essentially in this use effect, all we're going to do is every time our last message ref.current changes, we want to actually run this, and all we're going to do inside of here is if our last message ref.current, so if we have a current message, all we want to do is take that message and we want to scroll into the viewport. So we'll say scroll into view, and we're going to set smooth equal to true, so we get a nice smooth scroll. So now if we just type in our message, click send, of course nothing happens. We're probably getting an error. Let's see what that is. Use effect just passes penny list. That's not an array literal. Of course, this needs to be inside of an array. So now let's test this. Make sure we refresh our page, type in a message, click send. And again, we got an error. Let's check to see what this is on the console. Oh yeah, of course, we don't actually need this ref inside of here. Let's just remove this. So this effect will run every single time we render. And now what we can do is finally type in a message, click send. And again, it didn't work. Of course, inspect, we have no error this time, so there's something else happening. And of course, obviously, we aren't setting this last message ref to anything. Down here, we have our information to determine which one's the last message, but we're not actually doing anything with it. So here we want to set a ref equal to our ref for our last message. So we're going to say if this is our last message, then we want to set our last message ref. Otherwise, what we want to do is just pass in null because we don't actually want a ref. And up here we can say const last message is equal to selected conversation dot messages dot length -1 is equal to our index. So that will be our last message when our index is equal to 1 minus the length of all of our messages. Now, as you can see, immediately it scrolled us down to the very bottom. Let's just scroll back to the top, type something in, and you can see it scrolling us every single time we type. And the reason for that is because here our use effect is running every single time, but now if we click send, you can see it scrolls us down here. So what we want to do is just fix this so it doesn't change when our text changes. We only want it to be when our last message ref.current changes. So now refresh, scroll up to the top, type some information. Now the reason it doesn't work when you just add this last message ref.current in here like this is because this is constantly changing every single time our component re-renders, because it's getting kind of a new reference to that element. So instead what we need to do is we need to use a use callback as our ref instead of this use ref up here. So let's create that use callback. We're just going to call it set ref is equal to use callback. And this use callback, we make sure that we import it all the way up here, is actually going to be what sets the ref for us. And this use callback is going to take in a node. And all we want to do inside of here is say that our last message ref.current is equal to that node. We don't actually even need this ref anymore. What we can just do here is just say node.scroll into view. We can say smooth is true. We can get rid of this last message ref. Just make sure that this only runs once. Come down here, get rid of this use effect, and we can take set ref and set it down here. Now if we scroll up, start typing, you'll notice nothing scrolls, but as soon as we click send, of course, we're getting an error. Scroll into view of null. Let's come up here to make sure. Where did I put that at? Here it is. We just want to check if node, then we actually run this. There we go. So now scroll all the way to the top, start typing, click send, and you can see it scrolls us to the bottom. Same exact thing, send, and it scrolls us all the way to the bottom. So we can get rid of use ref and use effect because we don't even need them. We just have this simple use callback that is going to do this ref for us. Now with that done, we get to move on to the fun part, which is making this work across multiple different clients. And to do that, we need, of course, our server. So inside of our server, let's just go into there. We can say cd, let's see what folder we're in. If we say ls, we're in that folder. So we'll go backwards one and we'll go into our server folder. And we'll just type in npm init-y. That's going to give us a default package.json. And we need to install inside of here a few dependencies. We need socket.io as our first dependency. This is going to be for creating that real-time communication between the server and the client. And also I'm going to do a dev dependency. So we'll say save dev. And this is going to be nodemon just to automatically refresh our server when we make changes. But our server is going to be relatively small, which is going to be nice. And let's create that server.js while we're at it. And then once this finishes downloading, and of course we got an error, let's just try to rerun that to see if that fixed it. Maybe me opening up the file actually caused a problem. And of course that's what it was. So now we have nodemon installed. And we can come in here, we can create a script called dev start, which is just going to be equal to nodemon of server.js, which is that file we just created here. And now inside of here, let's set up our IO connection. So we're going to get IO, which is going to come from socket.io. And we want to call it and pass in the port we want to use. In our case, we're just going to use the port 5000. Then we can say io.on connection, just like that. We want to access a socket. And this is the socket that we're connecting with. And when we connect, we're actually going to pass up the ID of our user, this ID right here. So we can say here const ID is going to be equal to socket.handshake.query.id. And we'll be able to pass this in from the client. And then we can just join that particular room. So we're essentially creating our own IDs for socket ID because we have static IDs, and socket ID creates a new ID every time you connect. So when we refresh our page, we get a new socket ID. This is just a way for us to have a static ID that stays the same every time we refresh our page. Because if every time that you closed your phone and opened it, you got a new phone number, it would be a pretty useless phone. So this allows us to keep that same number consistently. Now what we can do is connect, or we can create messages here. So socket.on send message. So whenever we send a message from the client to someone else, it's going to come through this send message here. This is going to take in our recipients, and it's also going to take in that text we're sending. Just like when you remember before, when we were sending a message inside of that send message function, we had our recipients, our text, and our sender. This is going to get the recipients and the text for it. Then what we need to do is just loop through all of our recipients. So we'll say recipients.for each recipient, we need to send them this message. But one thing we need to do is actually change the recipients, because if I send a message to you, the recipient is you. But on your end, when you send a message to me, the recipient is me. So we need to make sure we swap out this recipient with essentially the person that's sending the message. So a really easy way to do that is to say, create a constant variable, new recipients is equal to recipient dot filter. This is actually recipients, sorry. And this should say filter. And all we want to do is just check if R is not equal to the current recipient. So what this is doing is removing the current recipient from the list of recipients. And then the next thing we want to do is take our new recipients and we want to push in the ID. And this ID is the person sending the message. So we're adding the sender to the list of recipients and removing the person receiving the message. That way, when they get this, it'll have the proper list of recipients for them. Now, all we need to do is take our socket. We need to broadcast a message, which is going to send a message to a particular room. In our case, the room is going to be our recipient ID. The only person in that room is the person getting the message. So it's essentially sending it to one person. And we're going to send the message receive message. That's the name of it. And it's going to essentially have the values of recipients, which is going to be our list of new recipients. It's going to have a sender, which is this current socket's ID. And it's also going to have the text for the message itself. And that's all the information we need to send down to this receive message. And this code right here is everything for our server here. It's a very simple server. So let's save that and make sure we say npm run dev start. And now we're going to have that server started up on port 5000 of our local host. So now let's go into our client, go into our source, and open up our context. And we're going to create a new one, which is going to be our socket, provider.js. Do that same RFC trick here. And this socket provider, again, is not going to be a default export. And we're going to need our export function for use socket, just like all of our others. And this is just going to say return use context of a socket provider. I'm sorry, socket context, just like that. And let's create that socket context. Const socket context is equal to react.create context. And we need to get use context from here. Use context. And also we're going to need use effect. And we're going to need use state because we're going to be storing state, doing something with it, and we need that context for this function here. Now this socket provider is going to take in the children just like all of our other providers, but it's also going to take in our ID since we need to send that up to our server because it's using that ID right here. So then inside of here, we can just say socket context.provider, and the value is going to be equal to a variable called socket, which we're going to create as our state for this application. So we can just say const socket and set socket, and we're going to set that equal to use state, and by default it's just not going to be anything. Now in order to get our socket set up, first actually we need to make sure we render our children inside of here, but now to get our socket set up we can just use an effect because this is going to be a side effect where we only ever want to create our socket when we initially load our page, or if our ID for some reason changes, we of course need to create a new socket. So here we can create a new socket, which is equal to IO, which we need to pull in a library to access, but essentially that's going to be socket IO. We need to pass in our URL, which in our case is http://localhost, and remember that's on port 5000. And then this is the magic. We pass in a query, and in our case this query is just going to have our ID. Let's just put this on a separate line so it's easier to read. There we go. We'll put this on the line too. So our query is containing that ID. So that's how we get that query ID up here. That's coming from this line right here where we pass that in when we create our new socket. Then what we can do is we can set our socket equal to that new socket. And most importantly, we need to make sure that whenever this use effect runs a second time, we need to remove our old socket. So we can say new socket.close. This is just going to close our old socket and create a new one. That way we don't have multiple socket connections to the server because that's going to cause us to get duplicated messages, and that's obviously not good. Now in order to actually access this IO here, let's just open up a new tab. I'm going to cd into our client, and we need to install a library called socket.io-client. And this is going to be the library we use on the client to access this IO here. And we can just import that IO from socket.io-client. And now once this finishes downloading, we're going to have access to this variable here, which is this function we can call to create a new socket. And now we just want to make sure here we have our socket being returned. So anytime we use this socket provider, we have access to a socket in our entire application. So in our component or our dashboard, our app here, we're just going to wrap this in our socket provider. And we just need to make sure we pass it our ID so it has access to that. Wrap everything inside of it. And there we go. We now have another context being wrapped inside of our other ones. So now we have access to our socket in all of these different instances. And that's really important inside of our conversation context. So let's open that up real quick. And if you remember correctly, we have this send message, but we want to make sure we send this message to everyone, not just us. So this is where we need access to that socket. So if we scroll all the way up to the top here, we can get that socket, which is equal to use socket, and make sure again that gets imported up here. And now we have access to our socket and we can emit a message. This message, if you remember correctly, is called send message, and it's going to take in our recipients and it's going to take in the text, just like what we have up here. And that's going to send the message to all of our different clients. And as you can see, it's going to come up to the server. Whoops, that's not our server. Let me open up the server real quick. It's going to come up to the server. Inside of here, it's going to loop through the recipients and it's going to emit a message of receive message to each one of our clients. So we need to actually handle that receive message inside of here as well. But we can't just do that inside of our component. We can't just say this, like socket.receive message here. And the reason for that is that because this gets run over and over and over again, and we're going to have tons and tons of references to this receive message. So every time we get a message, it's going to call hundreds of these different receive message handlers, because every single time this component re-renders, it's adding a new event listener. Obviously, that's very bad. we need to use effect instead. So we're just going to say use effect. Make sure I get all the parentheses right in there, and let's make sure we import use effect, just like that. So now if we scroll down to that effect, the first thing I want to do is just check if our socket even exists. If for some reason our socket is null, all we want to do is just return. We don't want to do anything in this function if we don't have a socket. If we do though, we want to say socket IO on receive message. What we want to do is we want to call that add message to conversation function. Because if you remember from our server, we're passing down the recipients, we're passing down the sender, and we're passing down the text, which is exactly what that function takes, this add message to conversation function. And then the next thing that we want to do, since we have that set up, is we want to set up a return here. And all this is going to do is take our socket, and we're going to remove that event listener. So we don't have multiple of them. So we're going to say receive message, and we're just removing that event listener completely. There we go. Now we need to set up our dependencies here. We're going to depend on socket as well as our add message to conversation function. But immediately we have another problem. This add message to conversation function all the way up here changes every single time we re-render our component. So we need to use callback to make sure that doesn't happen. So here we'll just set up use callback. And instead of having this as a function, we're going to have it as a variable. We're going to set that variable equal to use callback. And we're going to wrap this entire thing inside of that use callback. So let's just make sure this is set up as an arrow function. Wrap everything inside of there in that use callback. And this is essentially depending on certain things. And if we scroll up, you can see the only thing this function depends on is our set conversations. So we'll put that right there. So whenever this changes, it's going to re-render this function, but otherwise this function will never change, which means that this use effect won't change due to this, which is great because if this changed every time we re-rendered, it'd be a lot of unnecessary adding and removing of event listeners, and we really don't want that. So now I'm just going to create here a new incognito tab, and I'm just going to go to that localhost 3000, and this is going to just let us create a new ID. I'm going to copy this, come over to our contacts, create a new contact with the ID, and the name is going to be incog here. So now we can communicate with this person by creating a new conversation with them. We'll click on incog and we'll just say hi. And if I did everything right, we should see this on both sides. Click send. And as you can see, we see this hi message showing up here, which is exactly what we want. And we have the ID over here. We can actually copy this ID, add it to our contacts. We'll just say normal, click create, and now it has everything correct. But you'll notice one kind of thing interesting is this box up here is a little bit too wide. As you can see, it says, why does this name down here, which really doesn't make sense. So let's actually just go into our open conversation down where we're rendering all of our messages, and let's fix that. Essentially, all we need to do here is determine the width of our element. So if it's from me, we want to essentially align this box right here, and this is going to be on the left-hand side. So we'll say align items end. And if it's from not me, so it's like this, we're going to say align items start. So now if we save, you can see that now this box never is any wider than the actual text inside of it, which is exactly what we want. So now we can try to send a message from here. We'll just type in some gibberish, click send, go to incog, and you can see that message has immediately shown up. And we're able to communicate back and forth between these different users, and it's all with a very, very simple server. Now that we have our entire project built, I want to show you how we can use Embold to do an automatic code review of our project. If we just go to embold.io, you can sign up for an account, and you'll get brought to this page where you can create a new project. We'll call this one What's App Clone. We won't need to give it a description. We'll click Create Project. And from here, we need to link up our repository. We're just going to be using Git. We can just copy the URL for our repository, paste it into here. And then once we have that done, we'll give it a name. We'll say What's App Clone. And you need to tell it what language you want to actually check. In our case, obviously, we're going to be using JavaScript. So once that's done, we can just click Link Repository. It's going to load up for a little bit. And then we can just click this Scan button. Now this scan may take a little while depending on how long your code base is, as well as how many other scans are currently going on. So once this is done, I'll come back and show you the results. Now that our scan is complete, you can see that we have a score of 4.29. And if we click on this, we can get more information about our actual score. So let's just come in here, click on that. And you can see that we have a quality gate that's been passed, our overall rating, our design rating, code issues, metrics, duplication, and hotspots. This is a lot to take in, so I'm going to show you the most important aspects. In my opinion, code issues and metrics are the most important parts of this tool. So if we click on code issues, we can see that we have 41 issues in the client folder here, and it says that they're all low issues. So when we click on this, a low issue is essentially kind of like a warning. And you'll notice that most of these issues are from no unused vars. So if we click on this, you can see exactly the line that this error occurs. You can see that it says we're not using React. React is defined but never used. And same thing with app here. And this is from ESLint. And the reason this is happening is because ESLint has a hard time working directly with React because JSX is not really a part of JavaScript. So luckily with this tool, we can modify the ESLint rules, or any of the rules for that matter, and make them work exactly how we want them to for our particular project. So one way that we could do that is on a line-by-line basis. We could say we want to suppress this individual occurrence, but in our case, we kind of want to suppress all instances of this no unused vars. So in order to do that, let's navigate all the way back to our WhatsApp clone project. And actually, let's go one step further all the way back to here, where we can click on these triple dots. And inside here, we can set up essentially different configurations, whether it's for our quality gate or in our case for our code checker. So we can just go to code checkers configuration. And from here, you can see we have ESLint, JSHint, Gamma.js, and all of these different rules. We can even upload our own JSON configuration if you want to have a particular configuration. In our case, we want to hide that unused, unused import or something like that. We'll just search for unused. There we go. No unused vars. Just uncheck that right there. And essentially that's going to completely remove that exact instance of that hint for us. So now if we go back and we just rerun our scan, so we can come in here and just say scan repository, that's going to rescan our repository with that new, JS rule in place so that we no longer are checking for those instances of unused variables. And as soon as this scan finishes, I'll come back and show you the difference. There we go, that completed very quickly, and you'll now see we're bumped up to a 4.95 out of 5, so we have essentially almost a perfect repository. And if we go to our code issues, we see we now only have one code issue. If we click on this, we'll see exactly what it says. It just says here that, if I click on this, expected if condition curly, JavaScript allows the omission of curly braces when a block contains only one statement. However, it's considered to be best practice to actually put those curly braces in. So it's just saying we should have curly braces surrounding this instead of a one-line if with no curly braces. So we could disable this rule if we want, or we could go back into our code and change this depending on your own personal preferences. In my case, I would probably get rid of this rule, but it's entirely up to you. Now, the next thing that we can look at are going to be metrics. I think this is a great tool for figuring out exactly how good your code is. So if we just go back here to our overall project, we'll just go to the WhatsApp clone again, and we click over to our metrics. This is going to give us all of our different metrics, and you can see that we have one violation for accessing to foreign data and one for lack of cohesion methods. And just by reading those names, it's probably a little difficult to figure out exactly what that means. So luckily, you can actually click on any of these and it'll bring up the documentation saying exactly what this means, exactly what you can do to fix it essentially, and exactly how this problem comes about. And it does it for all of these different types. So as you can see here, lack of cohesion method, the one that we also saw is in here. It tells us the default threshold. It gives us all the information that we actually need to fix these errors. And the nice thing about these metrics is these aren't really like hard and fast rules that you can apply to code like ESLint is or Prettier. These are things more like, hey, your code maybe has this problem because it doesn't quite follow all these best practices, and it helps you to structure your code in a way that makes you write better, cleaner code instead of throwing everything inside of one giant function or one giant class. Another great feature about this tool is that you can really easily look at all of your tests. For example, test hungry methods, your unit test, all the things around testing you can check out in here. So if we had test, we could exactly look at all of our tests, our different coverage, and all of that good stuff. We can also look at a heat map, which kind of describes where all of our different projects are. So if we had some things that had a poor score, for example, all the way down here by -5, they would be a different color. Right now, almost all of our components are essentially this nice green color. And this one component over here has a slightly lower green color just because it doesn't quite meet all of the requirements because it has some of those ESLint errors being thrown inside of it. But as you can see, green is really good because almost all of our components are showing up here as dark green. And if we had components that maybe had a lot of errors, they would show up as red on this heat map. So it's easy to see what percentage of your code base is good code versus bad code just by looking at this heat map here. And that's all it takes to create this WhatsApp clone. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out my other videos linked over here and subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. Thank you very much for watching and have a good day.